Knight G1, E2. Pawn A6. Knight G3. Knight B8, D7. Pawn A4. Pawn H5. Bishop E2. Pawn E5. Bishop E3. Pawn takes D4. Bishop takes D4. Knight E5. Pawn H3. Queen E7. Pawn F4. Pawn H4. Knight F1. Knight C6. Knight D5. Queen D8. Bishop C3. Castles kingside. Knight D2. Knight takes D5. Pawn C4 takes D5. Knight D4. Castles kingside. Rook E8. Bishop D3. Pawn C6. Pawn F5. Pawn takes D5. Pawn F6. Bishop takes F6. Knight B3. Pawn takes E4. Rook takes F6. Queen takes F6. Bishop takes D4. Queen G5. Bishop C4. Bishop takes H3. Queen F1. Bishop E6. Bishop takes E6. Rook takes E6. King H1. Pawn E3. Knight C1. Pawn H3. Knight E2. Rook E4. Queen F3. Pawn takes G2. King G1. Queen H4. Pawn D4. Knight F6. Pawn C4. Pawn G6. Knight C3. Bishop G7. Pawn E4. Pawn D6. Pawn H3. Castles kingside. Bishop E3. Pawn E5. Pawn D5. Knight H5. Bishop E2. Pawn F5. Bishop takes H5. Pawn takes h5. Queen takes h5. Pawn f4. Bishop d2. Knight d7. Castles queenside. Knight f6. Queen e2. Queen e8. Knight f3. Pawn c5. King b1. Pawn a6. Pawn g4. Bishop d7. Knight h4. Pawn b5. Knight f5. Pawn b4. Knight takes d6. Queen e7. Knight f5. Bishop takes f5. Pawn e4 takes f5. Pawn takes c3. Bishop takes c3. Knight d7. Pawn d6. Queen f7. Pawn f3. Rook a8, b8. Rook d5. Knight b6. Rook h1, d1. Knight takes d5. Rook takes d5. Pawn e4. Pawn f6. Bishop takes f6. Rook f5. Bishop takes c3. Rook takes f7. Rook takes b2. Queen takes b2. Bishop takes b2. Rook e7. Pawn takes f3. Rook e1. Pawn f2. Rook f1. Bishop d4. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Pawn d4. Bishop g7. Knight c3. Knight f6. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Bishop e2. Castles kingside. Bishop g5. Knight b8, d7. Queen c1. Pawn c5. Pawn d5. Pawn b5. Pawn takes b5. Pawn a6. Pawn a4. Queen a5. Bishop d2. Pawn takes b5. Knight takes b5. Queen b6. Queen c2. Bishop a6. Knight f3. Bishop takes b5. Bishop takes b5. Queen takes b5. Pawn takes b5. Rook takes a1. Bishop c1. Knight takes e4. Castles kingside. Knight e4, f6. Pawn b4. Knight takes d5. Bishop d2. Rook f8, a8. Pawn takes c5. Rook takes f1. King takes f1. Rook a1. King e2. Knight takes c5. Queen c4. Pawn e6. Pawn b6. Knight takes b6. Queen b5. Knight b6, d7. Bishop e3. Bishop f8. Knight d4. Rook a2. King f1. Rook a1. King e2. Pawn e5. Knight c6. Rook a2. King f1. Rook a1. King e2. Rook a2. King f1. Rook a6. Bishop takes c5. Knight takes c5. Pawn g3. Rook a1. King g2. Knight e6. Queen b8. Rook d1. Queen b2. Rook d5. Queen b8. Rook c5. Knight e7. King g7. Knight c8. Rook d5. Queen a8. Rook d2. Knight b6. Knight c5. Knight c4. Rook d4. Knight e3. Bishop e7. Pawn h4. Pawn h5. Knight d5. Bishop d8. King f3. Knight e6. Queen c6. Rook d2. King e3. Rook e2. King d3. Pawn e4. King c4. Rook c2. Knight c3. Bishop f6. Queen takes e4. Rook takes c3. King d5. Rook c5. King takes d6. Bishop e5. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Bishop e2. Castles kingside. Bishop g5. Pawn c5. Pawn d5. Pawn b5. Pawn takes b5. Pawn a6. Pawn a4. Pawn h6. Bishop d2. Pawn e6. Pawn takes e6. Bishop takes e6. Knight f3. Pawn takes b5. Bishop takes b5. Knight a6. Castles kingside. Knight c7. Rook e1. Knight takes b5. Knight takes b5. Pawn d5. Pawn takes d5. Knight takes d5. Knight e5. Rook e8. Rook c1. Bishop f5. Knight c6. Queen d7. Rook takes c5. Rook takes e1. Queen takes e1. Rook e8. Queen c1. Knight b6. Pawn b3. Rook e2. Bishop a5. Bishop e4. Knight e5. Queen e7. Knight d4. Rook a2. Bishop takes b6. Bishop takes e5. Queen e3. Queen takes c5. pawn c4, knight f6, knight c3, pawn g6, pawn d4, bishop g7, pawn e4, pawn d6, bishop e2. Castles kingside. Bishop g5, pawn c5, pawn d5, pawn h6, bishop f4, pawn e6, pawn takes e6, bishop takes e6, bishop takes d6, rook e8, knight f3, knight c6. Castles kingside. Queen a5, knight d2, rook e8, d8, knight b3, queen b6, knight a4, queen b4, knight b3 takes c5, bishop takes c4, bishop takes c4, queen takes c4, knight takes b7, knight takes e4, rook c1, queen b5, knight takes d8, rook takes d8, queen c2, knight d4, queen takes e4, knight e2, king h1, knight takes c1, rook takes c1, rook takes d6, queen c2, queen g5, rook d1, queen f5, queen c1, rook takes d1, queen takes d1, queen takes f2, queen g1, queen c2, pawn b3, queen takes a2, knight c5, queen d2, queen b1, bishop d4, knight d3, queen e3, knight b4, pawn h5, queen d1, pawn h4, knight c2, queen takes b3, queen takes d4, queen b1, queen g1, queen takes c2, queen takes a7, queen d1, queen g1, queen takes g1, king takes D1, King G7, King F2, King F6, King E3, King E5, King F3, Pawn F5, King E3, Pawn G5, Pawn H3, King D5, King D3, King C5, King C3, Pawn G4, King D3, Pawn takes H3, Pawn takes H3, King D5, King E3, King E5, King F3, Pawn F4, King F2, King E4, King E2, Pawn F3, King F1, King F5, King G1, King E5, Pawn D4, Knight F6, Pawn C4, Pawn G6, Knight C3, Bishop G7, Pawn E4, Pawn D6, Pawn F4, Castles kingside, Knight F3, Pawn C5, Pawn D5, Pawn E6, Pawn takes E6, Pawn takes E6, Bishop D3, Knight C6, Castles kingside, Knight D4, Knight G5, Pawn E5, Pawn F5, Pawn H6, Knight H3, Pawn takes F5, Pawn takes F5, Pawn B5, Bishop E3, Pawn takes C4, Bishop takes C4, King H8, Bishop takes D4, Pawn C5 takes D4, Knight D5, Bishop A6, Knight takes F6, Bishop takes C4, Knight H5, Bishop takes F1, Queen G4, Queen D7, Rook takes F1, Pawn D3, Queen f3. Pawn d2. Pawn g4. Rook a8, c8. Queen d3. Queen a4. Knight f2. Queen d4. Queen takes d4. Pawn takes d4. Knight f4. Rook f8, e8. Knight e6. Rook c1. Knight d1. Bishop f6. King f2. Bishop g5. King e2. Rook c5. King d3. Rook e5. Knight takes g5. Pawn takes g5. Rook f2. Rook e4. Pawn h3. Rook e3. King takes d4. Rook e8, e4. King d5. Rook e2. Rook f3. Rook e1. Pawn f6. Rook f4. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn d4. Pawn c5. Pawn d5. Knight f6. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Bishop d3. Castles kingside. Pawn f4. Pawn a6. Knight g1, e2. Pawn b5. Pawn takes b5. Pawn takes b5. Knight takes b5. Bishop a6. Knight e2, c3. Pawn c4. Bishop c2. Bishop takes b5. Knight takes b5. Queen a5. Knight c3. Knight f6, d7. Queen f3. Knight a6. Castles kingside. Knight b4. Queen e2. Knight c5. Bishop e3. Knight b4, d3. Bishop takes d3. Knight takes d3. Pawn e5. Pawn takes e5. Pawn takes e5. Bishop takes e5. Bishop h6. Rook f8, b8. Queen f3. Pawn f5. Pawn g4. Rook takes b2. Pawn takes f5. Queen takes c3. Pawn takes g6. Queen d4. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Pawn f4. Castles kingside. Knight f3. Pawn c5. Pawn d5. Pawn e6. Pawn takes e6. Bishop takes e6. Bishop d3. Pawn a6. Pawn f5. Bishop d7. Castles kingside. Bishop c6. Queen e1. Knight b8, d7. Queen h4. Knight e5. Knight takes e5. Pawn takes e5. Knight d5. Bishop takes d5. Pawn e4 takes d5. Knight h5. Bishop g5. Bishop f6. Pawn takes g6. Pawn f7 takes g6. Rook takes f6. Rook takes f6. Pawn g4. Pawn h6. Bishop takes g6. Pawn takes g5. Queen takes h5. Queen e7. Bishop f5. Queen g7. Rook f1. Pawn e4. Queen h3. Rook e8. Queen e3. Pawn b6. Rook d1. Rook d6. Rook d2. Rook e7. King g2. King h8. Rook e2. Rook h6. King f1. Rook e8. Rook d2. Queen e5. Queen takes g5. Rook h3. Pawn d6. Pawn e3. Rook e2. Queen takes d6. King e1. Rook d8. Bishop c2. Queen g3. King f1. Rook f8. Bishop f5. Queen f3. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Pawn f4. Castles kingside. Knight f3. Pawn c5. Pawn d5. Pawn e6. Bishop e2. Pawn takes d5. Pawn e5. Knight g4. Pawn takes d5. Pawn takes e5. Pawn h3. Pawn e4. Pawn takes g4. Pawn takes f3. Pawn takes f3. Rook e8. Pawn f5. Queen b6. Bishop h6. Queen takes b2. Bishop takes g7. King takes g7. Pawn f6. King g8. Queen c1. Queen b4. King f1. Knight d7. Bishop b5. Queen d4. King g2. Rook e3. Knight e2. Queen e5. King f2. Rook takes e2. Bishop takes e2. Knight takes f6. Queen takes c5. Bishop takes g4. Queen e3. Queen takes e3. King takes e3. Knight takes d5. King f2. Bishop e6. Rook a1, b1. Pawn b6. Rook b1, c1. Knight f4. Pawn a3. Knight takes e2. King takes e2. Pawn b5. Rook c7. Pawn a5. Rook b1. Bishop c4. King f2. Pawn a4. Rook e1. Rook d8. Rook e3. Rook d2. King g3. King g7. Pawn f4. Rook b2. Rook c5. Pawn h5. King h4. Rook g2.